morning, everyone. Again, warm welcome to our first session of the cubesys AVD series. This session is about the best practices in the security side of AVD. My name's Asta Singh. I'm the marketing lead at cubesys. Really happy to kick off this this whole series and the first of the events today. The title, as you know, is AVD Best Practices for Fortifying Security. We'll be unpacking a lot of dimensions of Azure Virtual Desktop, from security to app delivery to performance tuning, and basically be sharing practical insights and proven strategies to make the most of your AVD estate. Speaking of what next, our next session will be about traditional apps versus app attached. So just putting it out there now, and we'll give you more details about that at the end of the session. Now, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Gadigal land on which we meet today, and pay our respects to elders past and present. I'd love to also introduce our panel today. We have Paul Maitre, Azure Strategic Engagements Lead in the ANZ, SMC and corporate markets of Microsoft. We have Jeremy Clarke, Director of End User Computing at Cochlear, who is also one of our customers. Welcome, Jeremy and Paul. And we have our Senior Cloud Consultant at cubesys, Andrew Matthews. Thank you, Andrew, for sharing most of these insights today, and myself. So the discussion format today will be basically about asking questions whenever the audience wants. So you can drop in your questions in the chat. This is obviously being recorded, so just to let you guys know. We have our experts to answer your questions in chat, as well as however much time is remaining. We'll do that too. And all of the video content and the slides will be sent to you in an email post-event. So stay tuned for that. With this, I'm going to hand over to Andy to get started with the first introduction of the topic.
Thanks, Asta. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. On our screen here today are sort of the core technology areas, I suppose, we're going to talk to. And the way I've approached this is we've sort of, I think cubesys now is over 100 AVD projects, and I've probably been involved with perhaps 3/4 of those, I think. And the way I approach this is what usually comes up when we're engaging with a customer, and what areas do we address. And the idea, as Asta said, is not to, I don't want to go through this and say, do this, do this, do this, don't do this. It's more of an interactive discussion, hopefully, and more also addressing those points, but also, what are some gotchas? What are the implications of doing and not doing things, and how does that implement security, and vice versa? So that's my approach with this, and they're the sort of areas we'll be talking to today. The AVD usage personas one might seem a bit odd to start with, but I'll get to that in a moment, and the rest are pretty sort of self-explanatory, I think. So I want to sort of talk to those main points, but please feel free. This is just a guide. If any topic comes up that you're interested in, or doesn't come up rather, that you're interested in, please put it in the chat and we'll address that as we go through this. So I might get you to move to the next slide, please, Asta. So when we engage with a client, this is probably one of the first things that the discussion's framed around, because it determines your direction, probably highlights your potential blockers, what's required, that sort of thing. And it certainly does for security as well. So at a high level, simplistically, when we're moving to Azure Virtual Desktop, we're looking at replacing usually some sort of on-premises infrastructure, Citrix, for example, and replicating that in Azure. Most often it's multi-session desktops or remote apps, but it can be personal desktops as well. From a security perspective, and Jeremy, I might get you to sort of comment on this in a moment. But with your multi-session desktops, for example, especially if you're perhaps going to Windows 11 multi-session for the first time, what's the supportability of your incumbent? Like we always ask about apps, but thinking about security, if you've got certain network controls that are applied by various agents, do those agents support multi-session desktops, and do they identify individual user traffic? That you've got to align to that in the first place. And Jeremy, I know you're smiling before. I know you can comment on that. And similarly, personal desktops. If you are implementing personal desktops, what are they for? So if you're, for example, let's take the most extreme situation where you've got developers who are uninstalling or updating apps all the time, and maybe they need administrative access on those desktops, and that's just simply the use case. I know that's something we'd always try and avoid. How do you control that? What can you do to control that? So an option there that I'll talk about a little bit later perhaps is Defender for cloud apps, to keep control of your apps and visibility of your apps and where your data is also going amongst those apps. But the type of persona, usage persona, I suppose you're using, really frames those initial conversations. Jeremy, maybe, it's a good opportunity for you to talk about what your personas were, I suppose, and what challenges you faced in that regard.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Andy. And just going back to the multi-session piece, it's a really great point. We went into this not knowing that certain apps and services that we run on our environment wouldn't support multi-session. We use an extensive always-on VPN SASE solution, which provides web proxy agent services and so forth. Wouldn't work in a multi-session environment for us, which is unfortunate. Hasn't stopped us from optimizing and using the AVD environment, and it's used extensively throughout Cochlear, but something to very much be aware of going into that. We tripped up over that one, but I got around the problem. But and essentially we've not been able to implement the full benefits of multi-session. Obviously, something we're working very closely with our service provider to resolve, but we'll get there. On the persona front, we run 4 personas inside of Cochlear. They relate to the nature of the way we use the AVD solution. So just kind of stepping back for a second, AVD for us is a solution we provide to third parties that contact and support Cochlear. So whether that's a developer or a service provider looking after a particular service inside of Cochlear or whatever it might be, then the purpose of our AVD implementation is really to provide that platform for them to come into the organization. We have 4 primary personas that relate to developer at the top level down to a simple collaborator at the entry level, and they really reflect, or it reflects the level of service or services that we provide to them. So whether it's a developer with their own persistent desktop and number of CPUs, RAM, so on and so forth, down to a basic user that is just collaborating on a particular project. Back to you, Andy.
Thanks, Jeremy. Actually, you just reminded me of something I think is applicable to your environment. Something that's kind of in between those 2 use cases, or the AVD host pool types there, is the pooled personal desktop. So multi-session is non-persistent, and personal desktop you traditionally think of as persistent and something that's assigned to a user and they keep it. But there was also, I think there was a use case, one of those use cases involved a pooled personal desktop. Is that right?
That's right, yes, and we've done some work with that one as well, on the pooled personal desktop. As I say, that for us, a lot of the work, certainly in the developer space, can be long periods of compiling code and so forth. So having those desktops time out after a period of time is not an option in certain cases. So optimizing that delivery so that we get the best value while delivering a semi-persistent environment is really important to us.
Yeah, great, thank you. Paul, any comments on this topic while we're here?
Oh, I just wanted to add, I found when I had the conversation with Jeremy, his use cases were quite interesting, and it also aligned to where we see a lot of customers, why they look at these AVD solutions and offerings. It's looking at it from terms of, how are you going to keep your organizational data and applications safe? So there's that high level security aspect, but even doubling down to those personas you talked about, Jeremy, it's looking at how are you meeting those specific needs for those user groups coming in and those personas around what they're doing and how they're doing that in specific application use. And there's other elements where they're taken into heavy, thick client application design and usage within that. And then all those demand elements around how do you keep the persistent service going for some of these use cases. So I really found that quite an interesting use case you had at Cochlear, and then linking it back to where we see other clients taking these solutions on. So I think it's a very pertinent use of AVD within Cochlear.
And so I have a question for you then, Paul. What kind of what Microsoft tools or services would you then recommend the customers such as Cochlear prioritize?
In terms of the type of applications, or more, how do you support them?
While they start to build a secure AVD deployment?
I'd be looking at the applications within the organisation that a lot of different, I'll call it different staff and itinerant workforce have to get in and use. If you think around, sorry, I thought someone was asking a question then. If you look at those apps, whether it be the thick client server app or if it's a thin one, how often are they needed to be used by various staff? So I'd be looking at where is it that you're going to get greater cost efficiencies out of running AVD type service on some of those intensive infrastructure environments, so that you get that flexibility and cost savings around that. So again, to be looking at the type of apps and where they're being used and the type of volume of staff coming in to use that, and how are you going to get some of those cost-effective approaches.
Fantastic. Andy, I'll let you take over the next.
Sure. Yeah, that's okay. Thank you, Asa. So identity. So in a nutshell, you need an identity in Entra to use AVD. And typically in only think about two where this doesn't apply in the projects I've been involved with. The customer has Active Directory and they're syncing their on-prem Active Directory user accounts into Entra ID to establish that identity. Usually with Entra Connect, there might be other third-party synchronization or identity management tools facilitating that, but that's usually the case. Also, something to bear in mind with this, and I've sort of jogged my memory when Paul was talking just before, with your applications or with your identity rather, the end game generally that we're all after, looking towards that full cloud estate goalposts that we're aiming for, is a single user identity. So by that I mean the same username in on-prem AD as well as Entra ID, and ideally that also is the same as your email address, and that facilitates ease of use and the user experience for your users. Facilitates single sign-on to your applications, especially if your applications are integrated with Entra ID, which is often, probably usually something that users are looking to, customers are looking to do, and it also facilitates better management. With Active Directory in particular, when we're talking to a customer, one of the first questions we ask is, do you have Active Directory services in Azure? Where if you've got AD and you manage your workstations and servers with AD, you obviously want to manage your AVD session hosts with in AD and join them to your Active Directory domain and utilize those domain services. So our first question is, do you have Active Directory services available in Azure? And that implies, do you have network connectivity as well? But that's the next slide, and I'll get to that in a moment. It is recommended to have Active Directory extended into Azure. So essentially what I mean by that is it's an extension of your Active Directory site topology, right? You create a site representing Australia East, for example, add 2 domain controllers in there for redundancy and spread them across availability zones and have those services there for your AVD and other Azure workloads that need them as you sort of make that transition to the cloud. Something to be aware of if you can't do that, for example, if you've got security compliance internally that dictates that you're not ready for that, you don't have to extend Active Directory to Azure. You can have that hybrid network connectivity from Azure back to your Active Directory environment, but be aware, obviously, if that hybrid connectivity falls down, then there's no connectivity to Active Directory and users won't be able to log on to your session desktop. So that implies, the proper availability and redundancy for your hybrid network connectivity. Probably also just a couple of points with domain controllers. We have had customers that have not wanted to do that and suggested read-only domain controller in Azure because their security team was hesitant to put a writable domain controller in Azure. That's generally not recommended, and in some cases, in fact, it's not supported. So, for example, if you wanted to leverage Azure NetApp files for your user profile storage, for example, for those non-persistent environments, they don't support NetApp files, doesn't support read-only domain controllers, and we've actually had problems with that in the past. So that's something to be aware of. And with your domain controllers in general, branching a bit off topic, but something that's probably relevant, I think, is how you establish those domain controllers in Azure if they're not done yet, and how that's been done. And by that I mean, you've probably heard the phrase Azure landing zone, like making sure that those domain controllers are deployed in well-defined, well-governed, secure landing zone. That often dictates that it might be in its own subscription with its own network controls and own subnet, or at the very least in a shared services type subscription with other shared services, like your hub networking is an obvious example, and making sure that there's other virtual machine hardening that I'll talk about with session hosts, but that same hardening applies to Active Directory as well, making sure they're backed up, all that sort of stuff. So that's thoughts and general things that we talk about with domain controllers. Jeremy, is there anything on that front? I was ringing some distant vague bells when I was talking about that with your environment. I can't put my finger on it, but maybe you've got something there for us. Oh
no, I remember we had extensive discussions about whether we put domain controllers into our AVD environment. As it turned out, we decided not to, for all the reasons you described around security of the DC itself. And I think you're going to talk to network connectivity in a minute, but just very briefly, we looked at multipath connections into our AVD environment to get over that risk of or have a redundant connection in there to get around that risk. Just rolling back a little bit though to the points you were making around the identity piece and from an Active Directory piece, it's worked really well for us. And look, we sync our Active Directory, so it's a hybrid scenario. But we use an identity and access management tool extensively to manage onboarding and offboarding of identities, whether it's Cochlear or third parties working, with Cochlear identities on the AVD platform. And what that's enabled us to do is provide automation from end to end in terms of onboarding and offboarding, which is really important for us, reducing the number of people that are required to manage the environment. So that's worked well.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add to that.
Sorry.
I was just going to add to that because it's that increasing demand of that elastic type workforce of bringing contractors in, hiring them, and bringing back bringing them back in. You really need that flexibility to get that sort of out of the box, let's call it documentation and process flow of ensuring you've got your regulatory requirements and your local security policies enforced in a way that you're giving that conditional access to those apps and how people can log into them, and you get that control and security aspects happening over it through that element, especially with the need to scale up and scale down with those various workforces. So it's a really important approach to be taken for customers.
Thanks, spot on, Paul. I mean, we need to demonstrate that we're providing those layers of security, and through that process of being able to onboard and offboard at speed and scale, it definitely works well for us. And we're able to demonstrate the security wrapper around each of those identities.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. Cloud native or Entra is another identity provider option that we more commonly come across this when we have an existing customer that's looking to test out Entra joined session hosts rather than domain joined or hybrid joined session hosts. But there have been some occasions where it's been a greenfield Entra deployment. So that's fine. And if you're doing that, you're likely, instead of with Active Directory, obviously you're using group policy to manage your session hosts and other integrations with AD. With Cloud Native, you're using Entra and the controls it provides, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But likely using Intune to manage that, in the cases we've been involved with, at least anyway. So there's considerations with doing that with AVD as well, especially if you're managing session hosts with multi-session desktops with Intune policy, and even pushing apps, perhaps. Like, you need to think about, how's that going to work if I need to recycle the host in my host pool and I've got to wait for Intune to deploy, this configuration and these apps. How does that work? So something to be mindful of. We tend to try and still use a gold image to control that, even with Cloud Native or Entra joined session hosts. Personal desktops are different, persistent ones at least. Sorry, Asta, could you jump back there? Yeah, thank you. So that's something to be mindful of. We use one way to get around that. We use a third-party tooling to manage our AVD environments almost exclusively all the time, called Nerdio. And Nerdio has a good feature with this particular scenario where you can wait for a host pool when it's being provisioned or re-provisioned to be compliant with Intune compliance policies that you specify before it makes that session host available. So that's one way you can do it with some tooling, but you need to think about these type of things and how you manage them when you're sort of in that environment. On Cloud Native and Entra and Intune management with AVD, Paul, have you got any comments there?
Not at the moment. I think we've touched on most of those things, but making sure that you've got the policies and the conditional access there, and potentially even moving down the additional layer of multi-factor authentication, which gets to that whole concept of zero trust approach that we take on here at Microsoft. So I think that's a whole nother topic we can jump into. But,
absolutely.
This all leads to that. I do like the fact you've dropped and mentioned Nerdio, because we do work with them as a partner as well, and that helps get that scalability and flexibility, but also the cost controls happening as well. So it's something that we have used with similar organisations to Cochlear in other parts of ANZ that's been quite effective.
Yeah, thank you. And briefly, I think it's worth touching on here the authentication with regards to AVD. So let's focus on Active Directory for this example, where our AVD session hosts are joined to an AD domain. So a client is going to use the remote desktop client or the Windows app now to authenticate to Entra in the first instance. So that's the public-facing AVD service rather, and the controls Paul was just alluding to, MFA, conditional access, etc., which we'll talk about a bit more in a second, will apply at that level. When they log on to the client, they will, once they've authenticated and satisfied MFA, etc., they will be presented with their desktops, remote apps, their resources that they have access to in that workspace. They will then double click on one of those to open up a desktop, for example, and at that point they're authenticating to your Active Directory domain because it's an Active Directory integrated resource. So by default, you need to authenticate to your Active Directory domain again, and this is why having the same username on-prem and in the cloud is important. But more recently, there is AVD single sign-on, where by some configuration between Entra and your on-prem AD environment, you can get AVD to use the Entra token that you received in the first step to authenticate you to Active Directory. So that provides a seamless sign-on into your desktop or your remote app. So the users, it's a better user experience. They don't have to respond to two credential prompts. And the third authentication piece is the in-session authentication. So when you're on your desktop, so what I mean by that is authenticating to your applications, for example, and where integration with Entra ID becomes really important, and having your session hosts, excuse me, at least hybrid Entra joined, which happens by virtue of the Entra Connect we spoke about earlier. That hybrid join and Entra ID joined, or integrated apps rather, facilitates that sort of seamless sign into apps and less credential prompts and a better experience for the users. So there's 3 levels there: the multi-factor authentication and even passwordless authentication. So Windows Hello for Business or FIDO keys, for example, can be used to in the initial logon to the Active Directory, the AVD client, and they can even, if you want to enforce it, be used in session at the other end too for specific apps if you have sensitive data that you need to access within one of those apps and you want to protect it. So they're the 3 levels of authentication there. Astra, I might get you to go to the next slide.
Perfect, there you go.
So the securing access, when we're talking about securing access here, what I'm talking about is the user, the identity access to AVD and managing AVD. So I think generally these days, I think everyone's across MFA. If you have MFA enabled, you're pretty much ticking, 99.5% of the risk out there. It just makes your environment so much more secure. Conditional access, of course, is an extension onto that. And I think it's really important to have a good grasp on your conditional access policies and be well managed and well organised with those. Quite often, in user environments, in client environments, when we're establishing and testing AVD, when we've got the first test host pools deployed, we have problems with unexpected MFA prompts from conditional access policies that are getting in way of the authentication flow. So having a good grasp on them is important. So a good example of that would be OneDrive silent sign-in. So if you have a conditional access policy that's invoking an MFA prompt when a user's accessing OneDrive, for example, and you want, getting back to that point I was just talking about, that seamless sign-in and silent sign-in to OneDrive when a user logs on to a session host, MFA, if it's being invoked at that level, can get in the way of that. The user can still access OneDrive, but they have to sign in manually each time they log on, and you don't want that. So that's an example of how it can get in the way. And a way you might fix that particular one, for example, is if your outbound egress from your AVD session hosts is through a firewall or a common, it's a single point, like a firewall IP address, maybe you include that public IP address of your firewall as a trusted location, so it's not getting prompted for MFA and it's an exclusion in your conditional access policy. Identifying suspicious activity, moving on from that topic. What I'm talking about there is probably identity protection. So with identity protection in Azure, that's talking about risky identified risky user sign-ins or risky users, like leaked credentials, for example, and reacting to that. And that also can be integrated into a part of your conditional access policy. If a user sign-in or a user credential is deemed to be risky, compliance policies can act on that. Probably worthwhile calling out identity protection too is a intra premium P2 feature. So conditional access is an intra premium feature as well, but intra premium P1 or P2 can satisfy that, but identity protection requires the P2 licensing, and that's bundled into the E5 SKUs as well. Microsoft 365 E5, I mean. And privileged identity access into your environment. If you have, just keeping on that topic of E5 premium intra SKU, that has privileged identity management built in, and notwithstanding that you haven't got another product managing your privileged identity management, I think enabling PIM is something you definitely should do to really reduce the surface of the risk of attack on your environment and compromise of your privileged identities, and just general identity management. That's a no-brainer. On privileged identity access as well, probably something else we come across occasionally, and it's probably a broader best practice, is separating your on-prem administrative accounts from your cloud administrative accounts. So any owner access in a Azure subscription that manages the AVD environment, you want your administrative accounts there to be cloud only, and your AD domain admins or whatever they are should be kept as on-prem only accounts and not synchronized. Not that you can synchronize those up anyway, but as a rudimentary example, you want to keep those separate. The premise there is if you are synchronizing accounts from on-prem to Entra and they've both got privileged access in both environments and they're compromised, then the entire environment's at risk rather. That's probably all there. Jeremy, I don't think if you've got any comments on that one in the context of your environment, I think we've probably already spoke about it, right?
Yeah, look, and I think we worked together when we productionized our AVD environment. We were in the middle of implementing zero trust policies for the organization more generally across our fleet, our physical fleet. So we were able to roll those into the AVD fleet as well, which was wonderful because it gave us that level of security. Interesting listening to you talking about privileged access, though, PIM. We've actually managed to avoid providing anybody within our user community for AVD with any kind of a privileged identity management. We use a tool to elevate the access of the application itself. So where we have developers that are working on coding workbenches and so forth, we've been able to elevate that application rather than the identity itself. So
in the session, yeah, okay, yeah.
That's it.
Paul, do you have any comments on this slide?
No, I think you've both covered it off pretty extensively. So yeah, I've got probably nothing else to really add to that.
Great, thank you. Just looking at time too, so let's skip ahead here. Network security. So yeah, obviously, when I was talking about extending AD into Azure to support your AVD workloads, you need the underlying network connectivity for that, whether it's a VPN gateway with your on-prem environment, express route, or part of a broader virtual WAN, vWAN topology. As Jeremy indicated before, it was their requirement to keep their domain controllers on premise, so we needed to make sure that had their hybrid connectivity had multiple paths, and the gateways also availability zone redundant, so there's plenty of redundancy and availability built into that underlying connectivity to make sure that was okay. Secure outbound access. So when I'm talking about secure outbound access for AVD, you're obviously going to have, or typically you're going to have a default route that's going to point for your AVD workloads to a firewall. Not necessarily. Sometimes it's direct to the internet, and I'll talk about some concerns with that in a moment too. But if you are doing that, we want to make sure that outbound access to the AVD service endpoints is allowed. So there's a list of URLs that need to be whitelisted or allowed through any firewall or traffic inspection appliance. SSL inspection not supported for the AVD endpoints as well. That's going to break things. So we need to make sure that's, those endpoints are available for the session host to make their outbound connections to the AVD broker. So the broker and the AVD service can orchestrate connectivity between the client and the back-end session desktop. One way you can actually do that, if you do have a default route that's pointing to a firewall, is add user-defined routes in Azure and then use service tags to point the session host to the AVD endpoints, so that the session hosts are just routing directly to those endpoints in Azure for that connectivity. That's one way to sort of do that if it's acceptable for your security compliance. If it's not, then you just need to make sure the firewalls and whatever other network appliances allow that. One final point on outbound access too is if you have an existing environment and you are leveraging the default outbound access for VMs, probably aware by now that that's going to be retired later in the year at the end of September. So if you are using that, then you need to think about how you're going to address that. So luckily for most of our clients, one way to address that, if you are using it, is to route all of your traffic with a default route to a firewall, a virtual appliance, whatever, to vet that traffic. And luckily, most of our clients do that already, so they don't have that change doesn't affect them. But if you are using it or it's a part of your solution, then one thing you can do, for example, is deploy a NAT gateway in your AVD VNet, and that gives you your egress point to the internet for your AVD workloads. Another good point to make with that, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not like we're just that's going to stop working straight away. Existing workloads will continue to work. It's an important distinction to make, but if you're deploying new ones, that won't be available after that date. That's correct, right, Paul?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. Important distinction to make in case there's anyone panicking. RDP short paths. So by default, this is referring to the client network traffic now. So by default, when a client is connecting to an AVD service, they use what's called reverse connect to establish that connection, and that's over TCP. You can configure RDP short path for both managed, which when I say managed, I mean an inside internal private network like a corporate office location, or unmanaged networks, which is public. So a benefit of using that is it establishes a connection for the client to the session host over UDP. So it's beneficial, for example, if you do have a network that has some remote clients, TCP is a bit lossy and UDP provides that better user experience and can tolerate sort of network packet drop a bit better. So that's a situation where that might be used. Be aware though, if you want to use that for RDP short path for managed networks, you need to allow inbound connectivity to your session host. So all session host connectivity up to this point has been outbound. It doesn't need any inbound ports open. But for that particular functionality, you need to open up an inbound UDP port. I think it's 339 by default to those session hosts from your managed networks, remember, right? So this is your corporate locations, corporate locations, and then that client will connect via TCP and in the background negotiate UDP connectivity and connect to the service. RDP short path for managed networks doesn't mean that you open an inbound port to the session host from the internet. What's used in that situation are Microsoft-owned relay servers, to put it in layman's terms, that broker that connectivity between the client and the session host. And you just need to allow additional IP addresses, Microsoft-owned IP addresses and ports outbound to those endpoints so that can be established. And very quickly too, I know we're short on time here, Asta, but I'll keep going.
Yeah, I
Step
was
in
just
if you want
typing
to.
in the comments actually. If everyone's okay, please hit the like button so we can go over time a little bit. I'm loving the conversation and the topic's quite detailed. So if everyone's happy, we'll just take 10 or 15 more minutes. Is that okay? Thank you. Andy, keep going for sure.
Okay, thanks guys. And Azure Private Link with network security. So to summarize this, so private link or private endpoint in Azure is hardening an Azure service when you provision an Azure service, even AVD, for example, but it might be a storage account, a key vault, whatever. It's provisioned with a public endpoint. And you have the option to create a private endpoint for that service, whatever it might be, to integrate it into your own privately owned virtual network. And then it's governed by your network security group, your routing, your network controls that you control, rather than a public endpoint on the sort of shared Microsoft sort of backplane or whatever, for want of a better word. So you can actually do this for AVD. So at its most restrictive, you can lock down AVD entirely. So you'll always be able to authenticate to an AVD client, and that's the public-facing service, right? And you'll authenticate to AVD. But if you've locked down AVD entirely to your private network and you authenticate from a public location, it'll come up and say you've authenticated okay, but you can't access the workspace because you're on an unapproved network, or words to that effect. I can't remember what they are exactly. So you can lock it down in that regard. And it's the same thing for other PaaS services as well. So Azure Files is a good example. So if you harden Azure Files with a private endpoint, and Azure Files you might use to store your non-persistent user profiles for your remote app or multi-session desktop, you can add a private endpoint for that Azure Files, and then the session hosts and the private endpoint for your Azure Files are in the same VNet. So that traffic between the session host and the storage doesn't even leave your VNet. So that's a really good example, and that's typically the use case. You harden your services in that regard. That's private link. And it's generally recommended to use private link as well. Anyone got some comments on that, or will I keep going here? I'm happy to keep talking.
Yes, please.
Keep going.
We'll let you keep going, mate. You're doing well.
Doing well, okay. Hardening Azure VMs, and a lot of these would apply to the domain controller that I spoke to before as well when we're talking about extending AD into Azure. When I'm talking about VM security, so just to make this clear too, I'm talking about hardening the Azure VMs at the Azure resource management layer, not in the OS. The OS itself is the next slide. So hardening is an Azure VM. We always use these days Gen 2 Azure VMs that have trusted launch capability. So that's a really like a low-hanging fruit to enable straight away, right? It's just a tick box, and that enables a virtual TPM module on the session host, which enables secure boot and integrity monitoring. So that's something we typically always do. Data encryption, when I talk about data encryption at the Azure level, for a long time it was Azure disk encryption, and Jeremy, you guys used Azure disk encryption, didn't you, for your session host? So, and that's fine, you can still do that. So that's using BitLocker in the OS level. You need a key vault to sort of secure the keys for that as well. And the key vault, again, we use private endpoint for the key vault in that scenario to lock that down to just the session host having access. But another option there, again on feed generation 2 machines, is encryption at host, which essentially does the same thing. There are nuances, and if your security in particular, they might prefer BitLocker for reasons. Maybe it's to sort of align with what's incumbent in your on-prem environment. But encryption at host on a virtual machine encrypts the VM and the underlying storage and compute it's on at that layer, and it's a much easier sort of a solution to implement and manage rather than Azure disk encryption. Probably another benefit actually as well is Azure disk encryption happens at the OS layer, right? So it's using compute resources to do its thing, whereas encryption at host is encrypted outside the OS, so it has no performance impact on the VM. So that's something to be mindful of. When I'm talking about data persistence in a VM, if you've got a really strict security and compliance environment and you want to blow away a VM as soon as it's being used, one option there, you can do that a number of ways, but one option there is to use what's called ephemeral disks. So ephemeral disks are a sort of a traditional VM where you're attached to a managed disk which hosts your OS. It uses the solid state disk on the underlying compute, which is usually the temp disk of a VM, to provision the VM on that instead. So what happens there, if you power that machine down, you actually lose the operating system because it's on that temporary disk. But it does provide really good performance and simplicity, and it's one way to, if you do want to blow away your session hosts as soon as they're used, you can use that, so you don't have any data persistent concerns on the OS disk itself. Confidential VM SKU, so that's an actual Azure VM SKU that I'm referring to there. That has a lot of the security features I've already spoken about here, plus further isolation to restrict that workload and the user operations within it. So that's something to bear in mind if you do have stringent security requirements. And Defender for Servers is something that obviously is available in Azure and you can enable for your Azure VMs. Probably on that point, if you enable Defender for Servers by default in Azure, and all the features are enabled, it will onboard that VM to Defender for Endpoint as well by installing an extension on that VM. For non-persistent environments where you've got a multi-session environment, and it's sort of getting back to that concept we were talking before with Jeremy about does your agent support multi-session environment for whatever security product you're using. And it's even the same for incumbent native Microsoft products. So for Defender for Endpoint, you need to go to the Defender portal and download a script to onboard that non-persistent VDI to Defender for Endpoint in a specific way. So that can be done sort of in parallel with enabling Defender for Servers. So there's that point to consider there as well.
I actually had a question for Jeremy on this one. So Jeremy, for Cochlear, how seamless has it all been when it comes to hardening your AVD environment?
That's a great question. And look, as I'm sure Andy will attest, we are a very secure lockdown environment, certainly for our endpoints.
Lots of compliance, lots of requirements in the regulated industry that you are.
Absolutely, nature of the industry. And I mean, we hinge on our IP, so it's critical that we protect our environments. But we actually set our policies based on the CIS, or Center for Internet Security, standard for endpoints. So to be able to apply that into the AVD environment was quite impressive. I mean, we use group policy for much of the hardening that we provide across the desktop and across the the Windows environment more broadly. So yeah, look, being able to deliver it, it wasn't without challenges, I think. Andy, is that fair? But a
lot of conversations, yes.
Yes, but it was definitely we were able to deliver that. So yeah, I'm very pleased with that side of it.
Thanks. And Paul, so from the Microsoft perspective, are there any security missteps, if I'm framing that correctly, that your customers have made, or you've heard any stories while they implement AVD? How does all that work? Have you got any nuggets from your customer side of things?
Missteps. Well, there's probably you could go speak to any customer and get a misstep and learning, but I think if you take that approach of the zero trust security model that we keep talking about, and that's really looking at how are you continuously verifying the trustworthiness of accessing all these apps and then the requests for users, and especially if you're in a highly regulatory and compliant industry where Cochlear is, where you need to be protecting your IP, because in essence, especially with what you do, that's the basis of your business. So I think there's everyone's got a different environment, everyone's got a potentially different use case, but you're all struggling with how do I ensure I get that flexibility and I suppose the dynamic nature of being able to scale out access to key apps and uses of your data under that app in a way that doesn't a cost-effective way, but you control the access to that and protect yourself. And I think there's many aspects you can talk to different people, but I think taking that zero trust model goes a long way to probably protecting any misstep along the way.
Yeah, and can customers leverage the native Microsoft tools 100% to make this all happen?
Oh yeah, with 100, of course, yeah. You can do things by looking at, obviously we've spoken about Active Directory. You've got Endpoint, you've got Defender. There's a lot of the security products that we have in our kit bag. We are a first party security vendor, and we do make sure that all our security products are interoperability and they work with other apps as well. So you can start leveraging other things where you can go up even into looking at Sentinel aspects and I dare to say, look at some of the AI aspects that you can use to start running that over things to look at where do you see some improvements.
We need a separate session for that. We need a whole 60 minutes for the AI bit in this.
You could go into that whole area as well, but I'm just touching on it to say there's a lot you can be doing, and I suppose with everything you look at, you got to make sure it's fit for purpose around what it is you're trying to achieve. That's the underlying fit for purpose for the requirements that you've got based on the security needs you've got to plug.
100%.
Yeah. In the interest of time, I'll take 7 more minutes for Andy to finish off the presentation, but there is information in the chat. So if you guys look at the chat, we've dropped some links, we've dropped the upcoming events on AVD on different topics. So copy that before you guys leave, and I'll let Andy continue and finish off that.
Okay, Esther. Yeah, if you can move to the next slide, please. I totally agree with what you were saying there, Paul, and zero trust is the underlying tenet in which sort of all this conversation is based. And I think Cochlear, Jeremy, is a really good example. Like it was some work, wasn't it? But it's a good example of implementing like security and zero trust to the nth degree, and it can be done and it can be effective, and everything's humming. And it's a version to that when you sort of talk to people about that, but it's not like that if you dig in and do the work. It's very possible, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the effort up front to, in our case, we ran a proof of concept and then build out the pilot to our production environment. But the effort involved in making that specific to our requirement, and going back to that use case again of third-party access, even to be able to limit the third party to access the specific service within our infrastructure or within the cloud, rather than having carte blanche access into the environment, it was really, really smart. So that level of security that we could apply around the AVD was a real win for us.
Yeah. And like Paul said, the native tooling's there to, facilitate whatever you want to achieve, like for your end state. So point taken. Thanks. Look, I think with hardening Windows, so now, like I alluded to before, I was talking within the OS. Configuration management, I might skip over that. We've already spoken about Active Directory and GPO and Intune and managing session hosts with Intune briefly. Session controls, so session controls is session timeout, but not just session timeout. It's redirection, hardware redirection in your session desktop. Might also be AVD has block screen sharing capability, screen lock timeout, all those sort of things, which I'm sure everyone already does in their VDI environment. So that's pretty straightforward. I think we've spoken about endpoint protection and vulnerability management. So Defender for Endpoint can provide all those capabilities natively, but obviously many third-party products are available there as well. Windows updates is actually probably worth a little bit more conversation here quickly. So in a persistent personal desktop, Windows updates can be managed via, in a more traditional sense. So you can utilize your incumbent tooling, whatever that may be, on-prem to update your personal desktops. They're persistent and they keep going. In multi-session environments, we typically don't want to update the session hosts on the fly. That leads to configuration drift and behavior drift. So we want to maintain that consistency between VMs. So we typically don't enable Windows updates on the session hosts themselves, and we control that with image management, which I think I'll talk about in the next slide or one of the following slides, and managing an image and updating that and releasing that on a whatever cadence is for your update release or application updates even release. One thing to be mindful of with window updates, if you do disable that and you are using Windows Defender, if you disable Windows Update and just do that, then Windows Defender doesn't get its antivirus update. So you need to cater for that to make sure the virus definitions are still coming down in the background, and you can do that with a scheduled task and a little bit of smarts. It's a well-documented, easy thing to do, but that's a little got you there just with Windows Defender. Moving along, Asta, let me get to I think I've got 2 more slides at pace here. So applications. So we've already spoken about Entra ID integration. We work with a lot of clients where we're trying to achieve that or replace really bespoke legacy applications with a newer SaaS integrated solution, perhaps. So that facilitates that seamless sign-on in the session. It also obviously, if it's integrated with Entra ID, facilitates security, identities, that control plane coming in. So MFA at the app level if you need it, conditional access, etc. Probably for the next 3 points, like application control, Defender for cloud apps, Microsoft 365 apps. So they're all overlapping, I guess. So application control, so Defender application controls one option. There are other third-party products that we use to do the same thing as well. ThreatLock is one of them that we use ourselves at cubesys. That they can have an impact in your environment and need careful planning, like we've already spoken about with Jeremy, but it can be done. Obviously, when you're enabling those products, you do it in audit mode first and look at what you need to enable and get your baseline right before you deploy it. But that's definitely doable. And maybe you've got to satisfy. We've had a couple of clients where we've had to align to Essential 8 requirements in the government, for example. So that have had to do that, and it takes some effort, but it can be done with the native tooling that was too. 365 apps, you harden that already, most likely with group policy. But obviously there's Microsoft 365 policy apps, which governs sort of what happens with policy in an app by virtue of the user sign-on in your Microsoft 365 tenant. So you can use that capability. Intune has app protection, and obviously you've got Defender for cloud apps as well. So possibly a good use case for that is, a personal desktop where users might be installing applications. That's a good way to manage that environment and get visibility into it to control that appropriately.
Okay.
And
I'm gonna start the closing remarks now. Thank you everyone for joining, but I would like to invite Paul and Jeremy, Paul first and then Jeremy, to have any final remarks, any good nuggets for our attendees to take away with them.
Good nuggets. Look, I just want to thank Jeremy, actually. I think the use case that you've taken on board with the persona approach, how you've looked at what is best for Cochlear in protecting, obviously, your IP around what you guys do and what you take to market with the offering, and I think the positive service you give back into the community around how you're helping with that. I just like to say thank you for that, because it's a pretty interesting use case.
Fantastic. And Jeremy?
Thank you, Paul. Very kind. And yeah, look, it's a great solution. As I say, for us, we're very much a Microsoft house. We are, and we have a fleet of 5,500 across the world. To be able to leverage this platform, and I know we were talking about mentioning it works overseas as well. I was recently in the UK using my AVD VDI. It works. It's impressive. So it's for our use case, definitely. As I say, from moving from an environment where we're providing third parties with laptops, Cochlear laptops, to be able to access the environment, to being able to do this and at scale where needed is a great outcome for us. So
that's a really good point, Jeremy. It's hosted in Australia, but accessed from all over the world, and it's done effectively and securely.
But still, that tagline, it just works.
That could be the tagline for sure. Well, but thank you, everyone. Thank you, Andrew, Paul, Jeremy, all of you guys for joining today. We'll send out an email, and if anyone wants to have a conversation with Andy, Chris, Shabazz at cubesys, any of us here, we're available, and we're happy to offer you a free 30-minute session. We'll send out all the details in the email, but thank you and have a great Tuesday.
Thanks, everyone.